Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Embrace webinar series. This is Embrace webinar number 24, and today we're having a conversation with Tim Tennent. He's the author of For the Body, Recovering a Theology of Gender, Sexuality, and the Body. Embrace is a suite of human sexuality discipleship resources and experiences which are curated and created by the Make and Deepen Disciples mission priority of the Evangelical Covenant Church. And Embrace resources are in harmony with the adopted position of the Covenant Church, the center of which is that the Christian standard is faithfulness in heterosexual marriage and celibacy in singleness. The special emphasis of Embrace is equipping our church to flourish in love for individuals and communities who identify as LGBTQ. My name is Michelle Sanchez, and I serve as Executive Minister of Make and Deepen Disciples for the Covenant. I am especially pleased to have a very old friend and professor on today, Dr. Tim Tennent. He has served as president of Asbury Theological Seminary since July 2009. But prior to that, Dr. Tennent was the professor of world missions and Indian studies at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where he served since 1998 and where I actually went to seminary. And I say to people all the time that when I think about seminary and my experience there, consistently, I recall my favorite professor, and that was Dr. Tennent, and especially my course with him called The Advance of the Church in a Non-Western World. He's a phenomenal teacher, and I was absolutely delighted to see that he has also now expanded and provided a resource with regard to the theology of the body and human sexuality. Dr. Tennent is ordained in the United Methodist Church, and he has pastored churches in Georgia and in several of the largest churches in New England. He's a frequent conference speaker around the world, and Dr. Tennent is also the author of numerous books and articles. Some of those books include Christianity at the Religious Roundtable, as well as Invitation to World Missions. So again, we're so delighted to have him with us today. A couple housekeeping notes. We'll begin with our interview, and then we will leave time at the end for your questions. But feel free to post those throughout. You should see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A spot, and you can type in questions throughout the webinar as they occur to you. And we'll do our best to get to as many of those as we can at the end. But without further ado, welcome, Dr. Tennent.
Thank you, Michelle. It's a real honor to be here.
I have to say, I was just absolutely delighted when your book came out because I had a reason to reconnect. I had an excuse to chat with you today. I remember our time together with fondness.
Thank you. It's great to be back in contact, and God's really blessed your life. I'm so happy.
Thank you. I had a great education. All right, let's talk about your book, Dr. Tennent. So your latest book is called For the Body, and it centers on this concept of our need for a theology of the body. Can you just start out with giving us an overview, like what's the main idea of this book?
Yeah, thank you. The book is really, basic idea of the book is to lay out a positive vision of the body. And my argument is that we don't really have a good theology of the body in the church today. We've gone under stress on it. And so basically, theology of the body is a Christian way of understanding the body. And that has, of course, biblical and theological and sacramental dimensions to it. And so the book basically revolves around three visions of the body. The first is just the created body. What can we learn about our bodies from creation? The second vision has to do with what I call the related body. How are our bodies related to other bodies, through marriage, childbearing, celibacy, etc. And then thirdly, and friendships. And thirdly, the sacramental body. What are the sacramental aspects of our body where our bodies are mysterious pointers to divine mysteries? So the book tries to explore and help people who really have never thought of their body in any other way than just kind of the cultural view, to really look at our body from a Christian point of view. And that really is the heart of the book, to lay out a positive vision for the body.
That's right. And so, of course, human sexuality then is part of what that is, but the book is about the body. You know, you take a more fundamental approach to a theology of the body, which I love. Okay, so tell us just a little bit of your story and what prompted you to write this book in this season of your life and ministry?
Well, yes, thank you. You mentioned earlier in the introduction, I am a United Methodist pastor, so our denomination has been really rent in pieces over this conversation. It's been very painful. I just observed kind of in our own denomination, at least, I can say that it's not been a healthy conversation. It's been a very fractured conversation. It hasn't always been known to have I would say, a serious level of discourse, sometimes an operate on a superficial level. And I had actually been really influenced early in my life on the book by Alasdair MacIntyre called After Virtue. It's, of course, a famous philosophical book on moral reasoning. And he argued that someday the day would come, if the U.S. lost its moral foundation, we would have a period, what he called emotivism, where we no longer actually talk to each other. We just shout at each other. Well, I think it's pretty obvious that his book was prophetic, because we're now in a place where we just shout at each other. And I felt like people were shouting and on both sides, but there was not really any proper engagement. And so this book was really trying to engage things better. I think secondly, I felt like just in general, I was displeased that the more evangelical community had focused a lot more on what we were against and never really got to the more important question, which is, I think I call it the second generational question: what are we for? I think the first generation is just like trying to get off their back heels, and they're in a panic and they just simply say we're against it. But the real question is always, well, what are we for? What is the great vision? So I do think there's some Neo-Gnostic views of the body that are re-emerging on our culture. And so these are all reasons I finally decided, in talking to Zonovan and Seedbed, let's write a book about it. So I did.
I'm so glad you did. So one of the things I like to do is, if our presenter mentions any books that have influenced them or whatever, then I like to follow up with an email to our listeners and make sure to include those. Can you repeat the name of that book? Where the prediction?
Yeah, the book is by Alasdair MacIntyre. He was a well-known Scottish philosopher, and his book is called After Virtue.
Ah, wow.
After Virtue. It's been in print for many years. In fact, now it's available on the web. You can get it on the web for free. But it's a great book about moral reasoning.
Wow. Okay. And then real quick, you mentioned that these days we're seeing some neo-Gnostic approaches to the body. What does that mean, neo-Gnostic?
Right. And in the early church, probably the largest, might say, philosophical challenge that the church faced in actually New Testament pages was a movement called Gnosticism. And that gained steam all through the time of Christ, all the way up through the 2nd and 3rd century and beyond. And basically, they did not believe the body could be trusted. And so they believed that the real you is the you inside of you, and your body is not a trustworthy witness to your identity. And so they had all kinds of reasons for this I won't go into, but basically it was a view that denigrated the body. So the Christian position has always been that the body is trustworthy, the body is good, your heart can be deceitful. The culture, of course, which is a Gnostic view, is no, your heart is always to be trusted. It's your body which will lead you astray. So we've had a flipping on that point, and I think our culture has been, re-brought into that worldview. So historically, it is viewed as a emergence of a new Gnosticism or a neo-Gnosticism kind of view of the body in our own day.
Okay, that is really helpful historical context. Speaking of historical context, you also begin your book by talking about how we're in a third wave of sexual revolution. Can you talk about that? What are these waves?
Yeah, generally the three waves, and there's many subsets, but broadly speaking, the first wave we might call the Woodstock generation. The kind of like reevaluating whether or not sex should even be kept within the bonds of a marriage covenant. So you have the rise of adultery, broken homes, fornication, all of that happened in the post-60 period. The second wave is really mostly focused on the homosexual challenge. The very definition of marriage became challenged in a new way. And the third wave is actually moving to a different status today. I think it's important to recognize the gender reassignment is really not about sexual practice so much. It's actually about the very nature of personhood, but it has huge implications for our sexuality because it actually argues that we're now in a socially generated view of the self rather than a biological or theological one. So basically, I would say, it's the that transition from, kind of open sex to same-sex marriage to gender reassignment are three different waves of what we're experiencing. There are many subsets of these, but that's part of it. And even applies, by the way, to things like video games. Video games are a wonderful technology, but there is a really question about things like violent first-person killing, where someone is trained to do first-person killing in a video game, or doctor-assisted suicide. Obviously, abortion, it plays into all these issues are playing into this, and it's all about. And I always thought, as a pastor, that the church was fighting 12 different issues, but I realized as I got older and more thoughtful about this, that it's actually all about the body. It's about the body. It's about one issue. So theology of the body is actually very critical because it affects a lot of issues that we talk about, but unfortunately we tend to talk about them in isolated ways.
Okay, so in light of this historical observation, which I absolutely love, I'm curious, we've clearly needed a theology of the body for a long time. Why don't we have one? Why has this been so underdeveloped over time?
That's a great question. I think I should say, first of all, that I want to give a lot of credit to the Roman Catholics who have done a lot more in this area for decades. And John Paul II dedicated years and years of his weekly homilies to this theme, and they've now been put together into a wonderful publication that I read some years ago myself. And so there's also a wonderful Protestant writer, Roman Catholic writer named Christopher West, who has made his mission to bring the theology of the body out to the Protestant world from Roman Catholics. So I think it's fair to say that it's much more of a problem on the Protestant side than on the Roman Catholic side. But that being said, I think, Michelle, your deeper point is true, that whenever the church is not in crisis on something, we tend to forget about it, and we go into other issues. And so unfortunately, it does take a crisis to force people to go back to the Bible and rediscover things that were once lost. It's just the reality of how theology works. So I do think we've neglected it because a lot of this was just assumed in the culture. No one really questioned when I was growing up, if you're a boy or a girl, man and woman, it was just assumed. And so now these things are brought into question. So in that sense, we're just recovering because the culture is asking new questions. And theology is always the answer to questions we ask. And we just have to learn how to answer new questions.
Wow, that's great. I thank you for drawing our attention back to the global capital C church, because you're right. When we look at what's going on in the Roman Catholic stream, we do see a lot more. And probably that has to do with their sacramental emphasis, which I know we'll get to that in a little bit as well. So you say in your book, today, every pastor and church leader must strive to be a storyteller. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I think that and this is different denomination. I'm not sure about how your denomination works, but some denomination approach truth telling from a kind of a doctrinal sense, where you basically rehearse, we believe these 6 things or whatever. And in the Wesleyan tradition where I am, Wesley believed in the Apostles' Creed, Nicene Creed, and all that, like everybody else, but he insisted that all of those truths be embedded in the sermon. He had like 44 sermons that everybody had to preach, that he himself wrote, and said, you must preach these sermons, because his idea was to take the theology and make it more into the fabric of narration. So that's been a big part of our tradition. But ironically, today we live in the Netflix generation, where most people encounter things through video. We've noticed just there's change of reading patterns, like what's considered a long book is really getting definitely shorter. And so it doesn't mean that's not a basis for criticizing this generation. To me, it's just people are learning differently, and therefore we need to have the courage to think differently about communication. And so I think that storytelling and narrative-based communication doesn't replace the other, but I do think you can capture people's imagination better if you're able to capture some of these things in story. So in my book, I do start every chapter with a story. It's not to make the book seem like it's light. It's just meant to draw people into, some of the deeper theological points you want to make.
Okay, and
Well,
then
the
you're also
incarnation is God's story, God walking among us. The incarnation is God's story, right? So we're entering that theodrama, as others have said.
Yeah, and I think you're also making this point about we have to strive to be storytellers precisely because our emphasis has been doctrinal with regard to human sexuality, kind of like here are the points that we need to believe, and it doesn't resonate as much. Folks are looking for a more positive, kind of grander understanding of who we are and what we're about.
And I think the culture has been so jaded, and rightly so, by so many Christian leaders that they've been disappointed in. And so I think at the end of the day, if we don't embody our holiness and actually live it out and the world sees it, that's a narrative. That's part of what narrative theology is that we actually are living it out in the streets, in our workplace, in our schools, in our homes, then we'll be unconvincing.
That's a great point, that we live out narrative theology every day. There's a huge disconnect right now with that in terms of how the world is looking at the church. Okay, so let's talk about the created body. What does it mean that we're created in the image of God, and what implications does that have for our human sexuality?
Well, yeah, this is a great mystery. The Bible never actually defines exactly what the image of God is. It's a feature that appears in Genesis. It disappears after Genesis 9:6, never used again until the New Testament. So based on the Genesis passages, generally speaking, it means three things, it seems like, taking those texts. It means in some way we are given dominion. The Hebrew word is that we often use in slang, but kabosh, dominion, authority in the world. We're given, we're told to be fruitful. It's about fruitfulness, which is really crucial, that we are to reproduce. We are to represent God's own fruitfulness. And we are to represent him in some way in the world. We're representative people in the world, which has, I think, relational aspects, that we know God and we know each other in a deep way. It also has moral boundaries to it. But clearly the dominion, fruitfulness, and representative are crucial, and kind of like all across theology, I think, what people say about it. What is so interesting is that the image of God language completely disappears after the opening chapters of Genesis. And so at that point, all we have are false images, idols. The whole world is full of idols. The word image as an idol is used hundreds of times in the Old Testament. But the image of God, as what's found in Genesis, the creation account, it's silent until Jesus comes. And in the New Testament, and of course in Corinthians, Colossians, etc., Christ is the image of God. And now this is being re-enlivened in us. And so part of my theology of the body is believing that the gospel is about the reinvigoration of the image of God, which is in everybody in latent form, but it has to be reinvigorated and reclaimed in so many ways to its full glory. And so the gospel in Christ does that in our lives. That's part of the Christian message.
Okay, so you also talk about the fact that our bodies are quote unquote icons, right? Which I love that word. It's a very interesting word. They're icons that illuminate God's purposes instead of ours. So talk about that.
Well, I have here in my office, I have an icon. I always keep an icon with me at all times. This is an icon of St. Thomas. You may know that I have a special love for India, and he's the one that brought the gospel to India. But icons are actually not meant to be like picture, like we was like paintings, the way we think about normal paintings. Icons are actually designed to be windows into another reality. So you're actually looking at the face of Christ, or you're looking at a heavenly portal, you might say. So the idea is that your body is kind of like a window into spiritual realities. That's a kind of a sacramental way of putting it, but you could easily just say a pointer to a spiritual realities. It's okay if the word icon is troubling, but I like the word icon. It's a great word in the church, and I think that it's a great way of talking about how our bodies are windows to deeper reality. So the book does talk about how our bodies serve kind of as icons or pointers to these realities, and I believe our body is speaking to us, and we should listen to our bodies.
All right, and then back to that word sacramental. What more can you say about the fact that our bodies are sacramental?
Yeah, the book lays out 7 building blocks for theology of the body, and the last 2 relate to sacramental. And the word sacramental is really interesting. It's actually, if you go back to Augustine, it's actually a larger concept than today, where I think if you ask the average Christian, I'm not sure, your viewers, but the average Christian would say a sacrament refers to baptism and the Lord's Supper. Okay, which is of course true, but the deeper meaning of the word it comes from actually a Latin root, sacer, which means holy, and the Greek word mysterion, it really means a holy mystery. So the word sacramental is actually this amazing combination of a Latin word and a Greek word into one new word, sacramental, a holy mystery. And so it really is a broader concept where God's mystery invades a lot of things. And so part of my argument in the book is that even like marriage is one of the great holy mysteries of God. It therefore has a sacramental feature to it. Or I even go all the way to the point, the 7th theology of the body, even ordinary things we do are liturgical, folding clothes, washing dishes, mowing your grass. These are all ordinary tasks. And part of my interest in the book is how our bodies are involved in a lot of ordinary tasks. And the culture wants to say those tasks are meaningless. You should pay someone else to do them if you can afford to it. But the Bible actually puts us in tasks like brushing your teeth. It's hard to pay someone to do that for you. You have to do it yourself. It's a daily task, and it is actually meant to be liturgical. It's meant to be rhythms of life which bring you into certain ways of thinking about God's work in our life. And I argue that things like making up beds and washing dishes, all of these things are part of how God interacts with the body. And because the same body that washes dishes is also sharing the gospel, it's praying, it's receiving the sacrament. The bodies are the boundaries or the bridges to all the means of grace. So anyway, the book, I jokingly say, the book starts out with God creating the world and it ends with changing diapers. To me, that's kind of the comprehensive view of the body I'm trying to lay out in the book.
I love that. So our bodies are telling a story, but culture also tells stories about our bodies. And one of those stories you talk about is the story of the objectified body. And what do you mean by that?
Yeah, and of course there's many examples of it, but I basically argue that the Christian view of the body is one that's holistic, that unites us, body, soul, and spirit, into one whole person. And we are persons in the image of God. And the world's gravity of the world is actually the other direction, not to pull us together, but to tear us apart. So I call this the disincarnation of the body rather than the incarnation we find in Christ. The disincarnation, for example, I used a lot of examples with, for example, media, especially female body forms, are massively disincarnated in our society. So a woman's body is separated from her inner spirit and her inner life and her mind, her thoughts, and the body is portrayed in a whether it be a billboard or a film or whatever. And so even when a young child is going through a grocery store line with her mother or father, and they're buying groceries, and they see a glamour magazine or one of these kind of like magazines like that, the front cover is in fact telling a story, right? And even the words say the story, but even if she can't read the story or read the headlines, she sees the body. And from our earliest age, and we've done a lot of surveys on this, a lot of people have done this, early age, even young children get the idea your body should look like this. And there's a lot of shaming that goes on, a lot of very, and recently, of course, the study has been done on Instagram and the impact that Instagram has had on young women, especially in their view of their bodies, et cetera. And so I do think that that's one example of our culture and the way our culture is objectifying the body. There are many other examples of this, but I do think that the media has had a very negative influence on how we view the body in our culture, and it's created a lot of fragmentation that has been just very devastating, especially if you look at the rates of things like issues like bulimia and issues of self-harm, especially among young girls, though it's true for men and women. It is extremely problematic, and it's not being addressed well. And the theology of the body actually addresses that.
Okay. So I love how you culminate your book in this concept of a discipled body. And you say that a discipled body really is the way forward. So say a little bit about that, and we'll go deeper with the discipled body.
Well, yeah, I thought the book would not be enough if I just kind of laid out the vision. I wanted to say to pastors, like, okay, what's next? What do you do? And I've got a lot of response from that. In fact, I have another book that I've just put out called Foundations of the Christian Faith, a resource for catechismal making, which incorporates the theology of the body into kind of what churches do when they disciple new members. But I think that we traditionally have not thought about the body as a legitimate part of our discipleship. So what I'm arguing is that we have to approach it differently. So really there's two sides, Michelle. I mean, there's the internal side of the church in terms of like, what do we teach our children, both in the home as parents, as well as in the church and our whatever kind of educational program we have. But also I think there's a public side of this in terms of what does it mean for us to go out into the world as the discipled people of God? What does it mean to go out into the world as being baptized and having received the Eucharist? And so we are walking mysteries in the world. And so I do think that we have to engage the public square in a better way. So I think that I do appreciate the idea that the answer to a public square is not to say, okay, we're going to keep arguing and shouting until we get a Christianized public square again, like the good old days. All right, those days are over. But the answer is not the other extreme. Okay, we're going to have a naked public square, where there's no religious discourse at all permitted. To even talk about it is out of bounds. I think we ought to have a truly pluralistic public square where Christians can engage a Christian worldview, and I'm delighted that the Muslims or Buddhists or others would want to do the same thing. I'd love to talk to any of them about their worldview, because at the end of the day, the Christian worldview is powerful and compelling. And so we have to, take John Niehaus, of course, the one that famously coined that phrase, we don't want a naked public square. That's exactly my argument in the book. We have to be willing to engage and say, okay, well, how can the Christian ministries, for example, make a difference in young girls shaming themselves and cutting themselves and going into bulimia? These are real social problems. So for us to be silent and say, good luck to the culture is not helpful. We need to be able to say, these are some real answers that we can give. And I think also on the positive side, we need to recognize the power of the image of God, that our culture doesn't recognize it. We believe that all people are bearers of God's image, and therefore they are bearers of God's presence, and God's speaking to them. They need to be tuned into it, but God is calling them, and we need to be willing to do that. And our churches must be places of simultaneously radical embrace of people and universal embrace of people, but also radical transformation. And you have to have both. You have to be able to say, all these great texts, whosoever, but once they come, we really believe in the power of transformation. So this book does try to help the church think differently about discipleship. It has to be a lot more than it used to be, and we need to be more intentional about it because the culture has its own catechesis going on and really full-orbed way. So we really need to work hard to counteract that. We don't live in a Christian culture anymore. We live in a non-Christian culture, so we have to be much more prepared than we used to in how we train people and how we raise our children.
Right. And so, yeah, in your book, you use this terminology that we need to transition from the Temple Mount to Mars Hill. And so I think you're getting at some of that, right? The Temple Mount being the kind of the religion, Christianity is at the center and it's in power. And that's our, from whence we come and engage. And Mars Hill is a bit more of a pluralistic reality. Is that about right? Would you add anything to that?
That's right. I argue that the Temple Mount represents the Jewish culture, which was the biblical culture, which is, cultural stability, revelation of God, and people gathered to hear it. Well, now, people are not, quote, looking for their church home. They're not listening to the church bells ring on Sunday morning, and they come gather to church. So Mars Hill, as you know, and Paul on Mars Hill, and I've stood on Mars Hill. And if you sit on Mars Hill, if you have a good arm, you could like throw a stone and hit the Parthenon. I mean, it's in the middle of paganism. And Paul was able to preach the gospel there. And it's a place of dialogue, of disputation. And that's really much more likely the encounter of most people today than the old Temple Mount. So I do argue we have to move to more of a Mars Hill type approach to our culture.
All right, I want to take a moment to invite listeners, if you have a question that has been prompted by our conversation, please go ahead and type that into the Q&A, and we will be moderating those on our end, okay? So Dr. Tennent, I know that you've said within the United Methodist Church, it's an example of one denomination that has had many challenging conversations, right, around human sexuality, the nature of the body. And so as you think about those conversations, about what the content of them has been, what the content of the arguments has been, I'm wondering, in a sense, what are some of the most helpful or salient points that your book makes to those conversations? I'll give you an example. So for many people, issues around sexual identity, gender identity, it's a justice matter. We're talking about justice, and the church is unjust if we are not affirming these identities as presented. And so, as an example, how do you respond to that, or how does the content we've gone over so far relate to that?
Yeah, it's a great point. And my opening chapter of my book addresses that very question, because I call it kind of like the Civil War. We have two sides, and one side saying it's about justice, other side saying it's about biblical morality, right? And so you have this huge clash. Of course, it's about both. There are justice issues involved here, and I think it is important for Christians to be really, really clear that a part of the Imago Dei, the image of God, is respecting what I call the dignity of unbelief. And people in our culture have the dignity and the right to not believe the gospel, that they could choose to be Buddhist if they wanted to. They can choose to be homosexuals or whatever. Those are all things that are part of the dignity of unbelief. And the Christians have never done well when we compel belief. And we, of course, this has been one of the challenges in certain Christendom models where that has been done, it's been destructive. So on the one hand, we do have a place where, even God does not mandate, he persuades us, he woos us. And so we need to have a persuasive approach to the world in this matter. And we should protect the civil rights of even those who disagree with us. That's a really important point. But at the end of the day, after all that has been said, you do have to return to the fact that in this case, this is not a lifestyle that we can endorse within the bounds of traditional Christian morality. So like everything else, they want to make this about either this or that. when in fact the biblical message actually speaks to both groups prophetically. And there's some groups that need to hear the fact that there are people that who felt like the church has harmed them, and they feel, and they have reasons, they have genuine experience where they feel like the church has not heard their cries, because there's quite a few Christians that are, for example, same-sex attracted, who are not practicing homosexuals, who are totally, absolutely committed to the gospel, to the Bible, and they're committed to celibacy, and they don't feel like their voice has been heard, and that they're trying to be faithful, just like we're faithful with issues that we struggle with in our own lives. And so I think part of the concern that we have is that we learn to have healthier conversations that don't just shout and try to silence people, but try to hear people and then think about it biblically and theologically.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to ask a question from someone who's listening in. What are some things you believe we need to let go in local church discipleship and alternately more actively engage to better embody radical invitation and transformation, so we are not engaged in naked public squares? I'm going to read that again. There's a lot in the question. What are some things you believe we need to let go in local church discipleship and alternately more actively engage to better embody radical invitation and transformation, so we are not engaged in naked public squares?
Well, it's a good question. I think that most, and I don't know about your denomination background, what your church does, but many churches have either non-existent or fairly low bar discipleship that is done in like a new members class, or maybe a confirmation class of a young person, or whatever may be done who joins the church. So I don't think really we're in a danger of having like too much. We need to jettison certain things. I think our problem is that we don't really do enough, don't expect enough. We also have a disconnect between what families are doing or not doing and what churches are doing. So sometimes families feel like, if I bring my child to Sunday school, then like, isn't that it, right? In other words, there's nothing done at home at all. It's all being like, kind of like, it's like outsourcing your discipleship to the church. And the church sometimes feels like they haven't been supported by the families at home. So we have to have a better collaboration of the two. My big point about, I think to your point, is to say we have to be both traditional and contextual. We have to, there's certain things, I don't care if it's the 2nd century or the 9th century or 21st century, there's certain things that every Christian needs to know. And the Apostles' Creed, the 10 Commandments, the Lord's Prayer have always been kind of the core of discipleship. But then there's always contextual things that are peculiar to your generation, our generation, things we're facing today, and things like how we interact with media and technology, how we view the body and sexuality, for example, how we understand consumerism, certain justice issues like immigration. All these are things which the church just would be stupid to ignore because they're all being discussed endlessly on the news every night. So I think in that way, the church will be wise to have, like, and even families, like, okay, core things that everybody has to do, but then also have things like plug and play, contextual things that are particularly important at that time that a young Christian needs to have some help in, because you know they're going to encounter it. And I think if you stopped and asked Christians, you would get a pretty amazing list of things in common they think people need to be able to talk about, and they get asked at work or in school or whatever.
That's great. And also, yeah, you talk in your book about what do you say? An ancient future form of discipleship. You talk about the need for an ancient future form of discipleship with more robust catechesis. So that's kind of a mouthful, but what do you mean by catechesis and an ancient future form?
Well, yeah, the early church distinguished, which we've lost this, between what it means to become a Christian and what it means to be a member of the church. For us, it's like all the same, but for them, they had certain things they did which led up to Easter. Easter was a traditional time. So during the period, moving up through Lent, was the time when they did instruction for new believers, and then you're baptized on Easter. But then they started a second phase, which went to Pentecost, where people were trained, it was called mystagogy, into the mystery of the church before you entered the church and took Eucharist. So they separated baptism and Eucharist by catechesis. So they had a much more extensive, because they're dealing with a first century, very cruel Roman Empire, unjust laws, people massively discriminated against, widespread slavery, huge sexual morality. It sounds a lot like our day. And so they realized you can't just like have somebody come in and share the four spiritual laws and they sign something, they become a Christian, we all go on. They just knew you can't survive like that. So they had a much more extensive kind of period. So I call this ancient modern in a sense that we go back and recapture the structure of it, but then we fill it with some modern challenges that we know that we're facing that maybe they weren't facing, because they would not, for example, have had the challenge of the ability of like prepubescent children taking hormones. Things like that were not possible in the ancient world. So we have some things that we have to wrestle with that are new. If you like, what do you do if your child comes to you, it's not even going through puberty, and says, I want to take hormones to suppress my puberty? That's happening all across the world today. And so the church has to be thoughtful about things like that.
All right. And then you did mention that you just recently released another book, which could be a help for catechesis, right? What can you show us that one again?
Yes, it's called Foundations of the Christian Faith. And this is put out by Seedbed. It's the West publishing house that Asbury is part of. And it's basically a resource for discipleship. And it goes through the traditional features of any catechesis, of the teaching about the Lord's Supper, the Ten Commandments, the Apostles' Creed, etc., line by line, and the Lord's Prayer, but also has special features about things like the body and holiness and ethics, things of that nature. It's also, I think, distinguishable. It has workbooks and people can answer questions and so forth, but also every section ends with a song. Actually, my wife wrote a song for every section, because it really does try to say it's not just about learning stuff, it's about getting into your heart. And so Wesleyans are famous for singing their theology, right? Famous Charles Wesley hymns. And so there's definitely things in this book that are unusual in the typical book, but I hope that people will enjoy it and use it.
That's fantastic. Okay, another question we have, a bit of a different stream. If the physical body is to be taken seriously, what are the implications for fitness and nutrition?
Oh, a great question. I do talk about it in the book, but I admitted that I'm not the best person to talk about fitness and all that. And like I do my daily routine or whatever, but I think I'd be pretty embarrassing compared to some of the huge fitness experts out there. And there's been so many great things written on it, but I do say in the book that the care for your body in terms of as a physical temple of the Holy Spirit, in terms of what we eat and how we live, et cetera, is definitely part of the theology of the body. We notice with our student body here, they're very interested in this theme and they are deeply committed to it. It's not been something I've ever had to convince somebody of in that generation. They seem to really get this point. So they're more teaching me about it than me teaching them. That's a great point, and it is very much a part of it. This book, I do highlight 7 building blocks for theology of the body. I say in the book, I don't at all believe that the 7 I highlight are like the 7. I think there's probably, 27 or something, but, and certainly the one, fitness and wellness and wholeness is important. We have a wellness program here at Asbury, but others are better able to speak to that than I am. But you're right, that's obviously a really important point. I also think that it's important to talk about how we view the mind and thinking, because at least in some Christian circles, we focus so much on Christian experience and we focus on the heart. We don't focus on the subject of the mind, how we think. And so there's a lot of things about this which are important. that need to be explored. And my book is just, one of many that could be written on this theme.
I also think about the reality of our contemporary society and why those are also relevant. So for example, people used to be a lot more mobile than we are, right? We have the ability to be extremely sedentary, which is a kind of contemporary reality, invention. Maybe you didn't have to think about it as much, quite frankly, in centuries past. But these days, I mean, you could be, especially with the pandemic, right? Most people I know have gained a few pounds. And so we have the ability to be extraordinarily sedentary. And we also, at least in the West, are very affluent. And so we've got all these rich foods, et cetera. So I feel like in a similar way, we have some unique contemporary challenges that we need to be mindful about, right, with regard to the body.
So true. Our daughter lives in Tanzania for the last 12 years. And where she is, it's such a remote area. If she doesn't, whatever food she eats, she has to grow it. I mean, there's no like store to buy something. So yeah, you can't live unless you are seriously vigorous.
Yep.
And no running water, has to go get water from the river and all that. And our culture can be very sedentary. So it is a modern thing that you get up in the morning and like go on a jog. And our daughter tried to explain to some of her people in her village why people in the Western world would get up in the morning and jog, and they weren't actually going anywhere. They could not believe it. They thought that's not possible. And they determined that we must be totally insane.
Well, you know what? Right here in Blur, I've got my treadmill. And I have to say, I feel insane whenever I'm on it. So I think they're getting at something. All right. So, okay. So let me ask you another question, that tends to come up when we're having difficult conversations, which is that many people do experience their orientation or their gender identity as, it's inborn. I was always this way, right? And so it must be something that, God has created in me and affirms in me. And so you also need to do that. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, that's out there. That's, lots of folks who end up kind of shifting their theology on this are dealing with those kinds of experiences and testimonies, right? I didn't choose these, orientations and affections. And so, it's cruel to try to get me to change them or whatever. So when you hear that kind of logic or testimony, what do you think about?
Well, yeah, it's a great point. And I do think that one of the other losses we have is understanding the fall and what the entrance of sin in the world means. And I think one of the best early discussions of this originated from Venerable Bede, who's often called the father of the English church, who centuries and centuries ago, later picked up on by Augustine and by Thomas Aquinas years later, was the idea that when the fall of man happened, that it created what they call the four wounds of the fall. Four wounds. And they basically argued is that rather than looking at sin as like there's 10,000 sins in the world that people commit, okay, and there's probably 100,000 or whatever they might be, what they argue was that all that's true, but they all go back to four roots, you might say, or four wounds. And so they argued that essentially all sins come out of the four wounds of weakness, ignorance, concupiscence, and malice. Now, what that meant was that they believed that certain things happen to people at the fall, and we're born with this. And there are people who have, let's take malice, for example, people who have a tendency toward outbursts of anger and sins that arise from anger, like would someday maybe murder somebody or rape somebody or mug somebody. Okay, those are sins of malice, and hundreds like that. And they go down the line, weakness is this lack of moral fortitude inside, where you become silent. You don't speak out. You can't you can't address evil. And so you let evil march on. These are all things they addressed in the early church. And one of them is concupiscence. Now, concupiscence is a word we never use in English today.
I don't remember the last time I heard that word.
Right.
No idea.
So concupiscence means basically disordered affections. Okay, so what it meant was that some people are in fact born with disordered affections. Now, this is not meant to shine a light on same-sex attracted people, because some of you are born with a tendency toward malice or toward greed, etc. And so they grow up in their greed. There are people who say, I have always had, I don't know what it is, I have plenty of money, I have plenty of income, but I still have this desire to steal things. People tell me, I've heard it as a pastor, people say, I just have this desire to steal things. I can't help it. I mean, I see something I want to pick it up. I don't even need it. I just have a desire to steal. So I do think there is a really important point that Christians do not, they should not at least, stand against the idea when someone says, I was born this way. Like, I can't remember when I didn't have this inclination, because it is in fact true. And so to me, it's not a productive line of reasoning to say, oh, no, it was all sociology. It must have happened when you were in high school or junior high, or you must have read something or saw something. No, I don't think that's true. I mean, it could have been reinforced by that, but the Bible does distinguish between the two phrases, I was born that way and God made me that way. Those are different things. God designed us to be whole. God designed us without any evil inclinations at all, of any kind, maybe malice or otherwise. But because of the fall, we have these 4 wounds. And maybe my life, I have my own sense of how these wounds affected my life, maybe different from your life. But I was born with sin. I was born with a sin nature. I believe that. That's part of what the gospel teaches me. So I do think that Christians have been, I think, overly bothered by this statement, when I think, in fact, when someone says, I can't remember when I didn't have this inclination, to me, that simply confirms Christian teaching. It doesn't negate it.
Wow. Okay, thank you. I find that extremely helpful. And I've never heard of the 4 wounds before. Who did you say came up with that concept?
This is a Venerable Bede, B-E-D-E. Yeah, he's a well-known, he wrote the first history of the English church. These are all people that can be Googled and you can find them. But Venerable Bede is the one that developed it. And then it was developed more profoundly in Thomas Aquinas, which I know you know his name. And he wrote, his most famous book is called the Summa Theologica, the summary of theology. And in the second part of his first volume, and is actually the 85th question that he raises questions. In his 85th question, he develops it to developing Venerable Bede's 4 wounds of the fall. And he makes the same point, and he develops it more extensively, that sin does go back to certain fundamental wounds. And it basically is arguing that sins have family groupings, where certain sins tend to group with other sins. And they believe, and there's no biblical, we don't know for sure if this is true. It could be that there's 10 wounds of the fall. We don't know. But this is just something that the early church raised the question. But we do know that the fall happened, and we do know we're wounded. How we talk about it has been different, but I think that's the point we're trying to make. There are wounds that resulted because of the fall.
So the word, was it concupiscence?
Concupiscence, yes.
Oh my gosh, concupiscence. Okay. Just a quick note that I think something that's interesting about that one is that it's about affection, which in and of itself doesn't seem like a bad thing, right? To have affection is a positive word. It's a positive thing, right? So now we have the concept of love is love, right? Regardless of what direction my affection is pointing, it's affection. so it's good, right? And I think that's one of the interesting things, like maybe to distinguish it from like malice as a wound, which most people experience as a negative action and a negative experience, right? So it's a unique challenge that we face with that one.
Yeah, the church generally has believed that evil, and there's different views of this too, but the evil has no positive ontology to it, in the sense that there is no such thing as Satan doesn't have the ability to create something. So what he does is he takes what God created to be good and he twists it in some way. So it's actually one of the internal conversations among people on this point of how we talk about that affection, because we do have this, the very point you made is true. Is the affection itself good, but it's been twisted in some way, or do we call this a bad affection? And those are legitimate conversation points. But it is true that Satan does take what is good and tries to twist it a little bit or distort it in some way, and that's where the problem comes. And Satan, that's one of his things. He takes things that are good. I mean, it's wonderful to make money and provide for your family, but he can so quickly turn it into greed and avarice. I mean, everything. It's actually right to be righteously angry about injustice in the world or how immigrants are treated or whatever. But then that anger can be turned into malice that harms somebody. So that there's no, all these sins are at its root often things that are good that have been twisted in some way.
Excellent point. Well, as we come to the end, I'd like to ask, what additional encouragements would you give to someone listening today who is same-sex attracted or identifies as LGBT? What are some encouragements for them?
Well, I would say to anyone that the gospel is good news. The word gospel means good news, and the gospel joyfully embraces all people with what God has done in Christ. And I believe that the biblical revelation is a great message that shows God's love for human flourishing. And sometimes we don't understand how that intersects with our lives because we have our own ideas. That's part of the sin nature. We think we know what's best for ourselves. And so I would just encourage anyone listening to my voice that the gospel is good news, and to come to Jesus Christ. We have a great hymn that we sing in our tradition called "Come Sinners to the Gospel Feast." It's a very well-known hymn in our part of the church, and I love that because it's about God is preparing a great feast, and He even says, religious people are the ones that sometimes get disinvited because they get caught up in their own, whatever. And God goes out on the highways and byways, and he compels them all to come in. But of course, they must be clothed in wedding clothes. They must come through Christ. But I do think there's a radical embrace of the gospel that we need to make sure is clearly being heard in today's world.
And how about any additional thoughts that you haven't shared with us already? Encouragements for pastors or any additional thoughts you might have?
Well, to pastors, and we haven't mentioned the pandemic, but I do think it's pretty obvious to all of us that while we've all become experts in Zoom and we found we can have meetings across the world, and I haven't had to get on as many planes, which I thank God for that. There are, of course, things we laughingly joke about positive of COVID, but I do think it has really underscored the need for a theology of the body. It actually has raised in the questions of everybody's mind. Well, what is embodiment? Is there a difference between someone talking face to face and going to church, like zooming into church, versus actually attending and being there? Can the Eucharist be given, virtually? Those are really important questions. So I think in some ways, one of the advantages of COVID is it has actually given a permission slip to have some deeper questions about embodiment, without being anti-technology. Obviously, I'm on this webinar right now, but on the other hand, it just still raises really great questions about how we understand our body. And one of the other parts of the pandemic is the rise of suicide, the rise of drug abuse, the rise of alcohol abuse. It's been really tragic. The end of that story is a long one. So I just think there's a lot of opportunities in the days ahead for pastors to really address the theology of the body in some exciting ways. I think people are ready to hear it.
I absolutely love that. And I agree that in this strange disembodied pandemic season, we actually do have some unique opportunities. Dr. Tennent, thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you to all who have joined us. Just want to give you a heads up that you'll be hearing soon about our next Embrace webinar scheduled for Thursday, May 26th. It will be on the book, Winsome Conviction, Disagreeing Without Dividing the Church. This is a book that has been recommended by Develop Leaders Mission Priority as a resource for the covenant. The authors are Tim Muehlhoff and Richard Langer. They're professors at Biola University, and they take lessons from conflict theory and church history to help us discover how we can navigate differences by speaking both truth and love to one another. So we're looking forward to that, and we hope you can join us. Again, Dr. Tennent, thank you and God bless.
Thank you. Appreciate it. God bless you.